For most of the last 100 years, the answer to which civilization came first was settled. Sumer, around 4000 BCE. Egypt, a few centuries behind. The Indus Valley, the Norte Chico in Peru, then the rest. At least, that's what everyone thought. In 2023, a joint genetics team out of Harvard, the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, and the University of the Witwatersrand put out a ranked list of human groups by the age of their oldest saved DNA line. The list flipped everything, and the group that came in at number 1 wasn't building cities. They were living somewhere most people couldn't find on a map. 80 years before that paper went into peer review, the question of who came first was supposed to be a matter of dirt. You looked for the oldest city walls, the oldest carved tablets, the oldest pottery wheels, and you ranked them. Sir Leonard Woolley's digs at Ur in southern Iraq during the 1920s and 1930s set the pattern. He found mud brick palaces, cylinder seals, and royal tombs dating back to the early 3rd millennium BCE, and the field accepted what those finds meant. Civilization began in southern Mesopotamia. Everything else came after. For decades, the only debate was about the order of the runners-up. Was Egypt slightly younger than Sumer? Did the Indus Valley start on its own, or under Mesopotamian sway? Was the Norte Chico in coastal Peru really as old as it looked? Those were the arguments. The number 1 slot was never really in question. Then in 1987, 3 geneticists at the University of California, Berkeley, changed the rules. Rebecca Cann, Mark Stoneking, and Alan Wilson put out a paper in Nature titled Mitochondrial DNA and Human Evolution. They had studied mitochondrial DNA from 147 people across different ethnic groups, and they had built a family tree based on how fast the mitochondrial genome picks up changes over time. Their findings shocked every field that touched human origins. Every living human comes down, on the mother's line, from a single woman who lived in Africa roughly 200,000 years ago. The press called her Mitochondrial Eve. Scientists called her line L0. The point was the same. Modern Homo sapiens did not start in the Fertile Crescent. We started in Africa far earlier than any civilization on the standard list. For a few years after the paper came out, the genetics world fought with the archaeology world about what this actually meant. The archaeologists said genetic age was not the same as civilization age. A people could be ancient without leaving cities behind. The geneticists said that was exactly the point. By the mid-2000s, a quieter project had started. A group of labs across 3 continents began collecting modern and ancient DNA from every culture they could reach. They were not trying to find the oldest empire or the oldest writing system. They were trying to rank human groups by the depth of their saved genetic lines. The mutation rate of mitochondrial DNA acts like a slow, steady clock. Mitochondria are passed down only from the mother, with no mixing from the father, which means every change is a clean signal. The deeper the line, the older the population. It was the cleanest dating method anyone had built for the human family tree. The method was simple in principle. Researchers read the mitochondrial genome of living people, count how many changes separate one line from another, and divide by the known rate of change per generation. The result is a number of years. A 50-change gap between 2 lines, given a rate of roughly 1 change every 3,000 to 5,000 years, points to a shared ancestor sometime in that range. The math has been tightened and tightened again since the 1990s, but the core logic has held. Ancient DNA, pulled from bones and preserved tissue, gives the anchor. When researchers find a 7,000-year-old burial and can read the mitochondrial DNA from the bone, they have a known fixed point to test the clock against. The technique has held up under that kind of testing across thousands of comparisons. By the time the 2023 paper was published, the dating system was no longer untested. It was just slow and harsh in what it showed. The expected list was meant to be a formality. Researchers walked into the project thinking the genetic ages would roughly match the archaeological ages, with maybe a few small changes around the edges. Sumer at the top, around 6,000 years deep. Egypt close behind. The Indus Valley around 5,300 years. The Yangshao culture in China, which had been building villages along the Yellow River since at least 7,000 years ago. The Norte Chico in Peru. The Olmec in Mexico. The Minoan and Mycenaean cultures of the Aegean. The list was written before the samples came in. It was supposed to be proof, not a rewrite. The first samples came back exactly as expected. Modern Iraqi populations, especially the marsh Arabs of southern Mesopotamia, carried genetic markers that could be traced to the Bronze Age city of Ur. A 2011 study by Nadia Al-Zahari and her colleagues, published in BMC Evolutionary Biology, had already confirmed that the marsh Arabs carried Y chromosome haplogroups tied to ancient Sumerian populations. The Egyptians lined up the same way. The Yangshao genetic line traced back through the Han Chinese with the expected depth. Then the African samples came in. What comes next is the part that still doesn't make sense. In October 2019, a team led by Professor Vanessa Hayes at the Garvan Institute of Medical Research in Sydney published their results in Nature. The paper's title was technical and dry. The findings were not. Hayes and her colleagues had studied 1,217 mitochondrial genomes from people across southern Africa, focused on the deepest known mother's line, L0. They had then traced the home region of that line using a method that combined climate data, fossil records, and how fast the genes had split apart. The line traced back to a single founding group that had lived in what is now the Makadikiti-Okavango ancient wetland in northern Botswana. 200,000 years ago, the region had been a huge, rich lake basin, roughly 3 times the area of modern-day Switzerland. The first fully modern humans, by Hayes's count, had lived along its shores for roughly 70,000 years before climate changes opened green paths out of the region and set off the first human migrations north and east. The descendants of that founding group were still alive. They were the Khoisan, the San, and Kaiko peoples of southern Africa. Their mitochondrial DNA carried the unbroken L0 line, and that line was about 200,000 years old. The Sumerian genetic record, by contrast, was a side note. A 6,000-year-old branch on a 200,000-year-old tree. The Khoisan ranked first. Sumer dropped well below the line. What made the Hayes finding even more striking was the lack of any huge bottleneck in the L0 record. Most ancient lines on Earth show signs of near wipeout events. A hunger, a disease, a climate breakdown, anything that wiped out most of the population and left only a small founder group to fill it back up. The L0 line, across 200,000 years, does not carry those marks with the force that other lines do. The Khoisan, by every measure, are the most steady population the planet still has. For a brief window after the Hayes paper came out, the response from scholars was calm. There were follow-up studies, method reviews, the usual cycle of proof and pushback. That didn't last. That was only round 1. In 2013, a separate team based at the University of Arizona, with geneticist Fernando Mendez as first author and Michael Hammer as senior author, had already published a finding that pushed the timeline further back. They had studied the Y chromosome of an African-American man whose father's line traced back to the Mbo people of Western Cameroon. His Y chromosome carried a haplogroup unlike anything ever listed before. The team named it A00. The first rate of change math gave A00 an age of roughly 338,000 years, with a possible range running from about 237,000 to 581,000 years. Later studies have made the case for a younger figure, somewhere in the 200,000 to 280,000 range, depending on the change rate used and the parts of the gene compared. Even at the low end, a 00 was older than the oldest agreed-on fossil proof for fully modern Homo sapiens at the time the paper came out. The point was that the father's line of human ancestry stretched back tens of thousands of years before mitochondrial Eve, and likely further. The father's clock and the mother's clock did not agree on the exact number, but both of them ran far deeper than any city, any tablet, any wheel. For the Genetic Age Ranking Project, A00 was a rewrite. The deepest father's line on Earth belonged to a small group in West Africa whose oral stories and material culture had never been counted, by mainstream archaeology, as a civilization in any normal sense. Yet by the only fair biological measure on hand, their genetic chain stretched further back than anyone else's on the list. The Mendez paper set off years of follow-up work. A 2015 study by Monica Carmen and others, published in Genome Research, tightened the A00 age estimate, and other work using more Cameroonian samples confirmed that the line was found in a handful of villages near the Cameroon-Nigeria border. The carriers were not special in any way you could see. They lived normal lives, farmed, raised families. Their oral stories spoke of a very long family history in the region, which Western researchers had earlier brushed off as memory stretched too far. The DNA suggested the oral stories were closer to the truth than the brush-offs. If forbidden archaeology and ancient genetics is your thing, hit subscribe. New videos drop every week, and next week's is going to push this story even further than today's. While the genetics labs were shuffling the rankings, archaeologists were quietly updating their own timelines. The agreed-on date for fully modern human emergence kept slipping backward. In 2017, a team led by Jean-Jacques Hublin digging at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco published fossil bones and tools dated to roughly 315,000 years ago, which matched the A00 timeline far better than the older 200,000-year estimate. The fossil record and the genetic record were starting to line up, but neither one was lining up on Sumer. And the timing of what happened next was almost too perfect. By the time the 2023 joint paper was put together, the rankings had settled into something the field could agree on. At the top, by deepest saved line, were the populations of southern and central Africa, with the Khoisan holding the mother's line crown and a slice of West African groups holding the father's line crown. Below them, by a big margin, came the Aboriginal Australians, whose steady genetic and cultural presence on the Australian continent ran deep enough to make them, by many measures, the oldest unbroken culture outside Africa. A 2016 study led by Anna Sapfo Malaspinas, published in Nature, had studied 83 high-coverage Aboriginal Australian genomes and confirmed that the whole population came down from a single founding group that split off from Eurasians somewhere between 51,000 and Powers 72,000 years ago, with no major later replacement. Archaeology from the Majidbeeb rock shelter in northern Australia, dated by Chris Clarkson and colleagues in 2017, pushed human presence on the continent back to roughly 65,000 years. After the Australians came the Andamanese, a cut-off population in the Bay of Bengal whose ancestors had branched off the main South Asian line somewhere around 55,000 years ago and never mixed back in. The Ong, the Jarawa, and the Sentinelese carried genetic signs that researchers called windows into the Old Stone Age. The Sentinelese in particular have stayed so cut off in their genes that contact with outsiders, when it has happened, has been deadly. Their line is older and cleaner than almost anything else on the list. Next came the Papuan Highlanders, then the early Native American founder groups, who had crossed the Beringia land bridge roughly 23,000 years ago and grew apart from the rest of the world for thousands of years before contact. Beneath them, the deepest East Asian lines, then the deepest European lines, then the various smaller branches that filled in the population map of the last 10,000 years. And only then, in the lower third of the entire ranking, did the populations linked to the world's first cities start to show up. The Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Indus Valley people, the Yangshao Chinese. All of them, by the mitochondrial clock, were latecomers. Their genetic depth was a small piece of what the older lines held. But this wasn't just about which group's DNA was older. What the ranking meant went much further than a neat academic chart. If fully modern humans had been walking the planet for 200,000 to 300,000 years, and if unbroken groups could be traced back by the genetic clock to those founding times, then the obvious question was the one nobody at the conference tables wanted to ask out loud. What were humans doing for the missing 195,000 years? The standard answer involves climate, how packed the population was, and the slow rise of farming. Around 12,000 years ago, the last ice age ended. Rainfall patterns shifted. Wild grains became plenty in certain regions. Hunter-gatherers in the Fertile Crescent began planting seeds on purpose, and from that point, the timeline of civilization we know rolled out. That answer covers part of the gap. It does not cover all of it. The Khoisan oral tradition, mapped through decades of culture research by people like Megan Biezele and Matthias Gwenther, holds story cycles that linguists have argued are older in structure than any written tradition on Earth. The worldview, the family systems, the rock art that still survives in the Drakensberg Mountains and across the Kalahari, all of it points to steady cultural passing down across time spans that make Sumer look small by 10 times over. The Aboriginal Australian oral histories include correct descriptions of land features, including coastal landmarks that have been underwater since the end of the last ice age. Researchers at the University of the Sunshine Coast, led by linguist Nicholas Reed and geographer Patrick Nunn, have listed these stories and matched them to seabed-shaped data, the underwater shape of the sea floor. The match is not by chance. It means that specific land knowledge has been passed down by speech for somewhere between 7,000 and 13,000 years, with no writing, no permanent storage, just generation to generation passing down. Nunn and Reid recorded 21 separate Aboriginal coastal stories from across the Australian continent, each telling of a flooding event or the loss of a specific landform. Every single one matched a checked post-Ice Age sea level rise in the matching region. The Spencer Gulf stories from South Australia told of the flooding of a freshwater valley that geologists confirm was flooded about 9,800 years ago. The Cape Chatham stories from Western Australia told of an island that researchers confirm became separated from the mainland around 7,500 years ago. The detail in the stories, the specific named places, and the order of events went far past anything that could be explained by recent invention. A civilization, by that measure, is not defined by mud brick walls. It is defined by an unbroken line. The same archaeological framework that had raised Sumer to first place for 100 years was about to make it almost impossible to see what came before. Within a few years of the 2023 paper, the bigger meaning of these rankings would force a fresh look at every standard textbook on human origins. The textbook updates hadn't started yet. The data was already in. There was another layer that this channel's audience would find harder to ignore. If the Khoisan and the West African A00 carriers stood as the deepest living human lines, and if the Sumerians showed up only at the 6,000-year mark with a genetic makeup that did not cleanly trace back to any single deeper line, then the next question was about where, exactly, the Sumerian DNA had actually come from. Studies put out by Iosif Lazaridis and David Reich at Harvard between 2016 and 2022 had studied ancient DNA from Bronze Age Mesopotamia and the regions around it. The Sumerian genetic makeup was a mix. It contained Iranian Neolithic ancestry, Anatolian farmer ancestry, and a smaller, less clear piece that did not fit cleanly with any of the nearby populations. Researchers called it a basal Eurasian piece, and they admitted in print that its origin was unclear. The Marsh Arabs of southern Iraq, the population most directly descended from the ancient Sumerians, carried Y chromosome haplogroup J1 at high rates, along with some haplogroup T1 that researchers had traced to early farming populations of the Zagros Mountains in western Iran. The picture that came out was of a civilization built by a population that itself was not very old. The Sumerians were a fairly new blend of older ancestor strands. The Al-Zahari team had checked closely whether the Marsh Arab DNA showed signs of an outside founding group, the kind of mark that would back up theories of an outside start for Sumerian civilization. The result was mixed. Most of the genetic makeup fit smoothly into the surrounding Mesopotamian and Iranian gene pool. But a small share of the markers were harder to place, mainly within the basal Eurasian fraction that Lazaridis' later work would also flag as odd. The genetic record cannot tell you who built a civilization. It can only tell you who the descendants of that civilization carry in their cells. In the Sumerian case, those descendants carry a mix that no single ancient population can fully account for. For the antiquity audience, the Sumerian king list has always been the document that muddles this picture. The list, saved in many cuneiform copies including the WB 444 prism at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, records reigns of impossibly long length. Some of the before the flood kings, the rulers said to have lived before the flood, are said to have ruled for 28,800, 36,000, and even 43,200 years. The first king on the list, Alulim of Eridu, ruled for 28,800 years by the standard reading. The eighth and last before the flood king, Ubara Tutu, ruled for 18,600 years. After the flood, the rains dropped sharply, finally settling into normal human lifespans by the historical period. Mainstream scholars have long treated those before the flood numbers as symbols, ritual touches, or scribes stretching the truth of a more compressed real timeline. The genetic age rankings brought in a different reading. If unbroken human lines had existed for 200,000 years before the first Mesopotamian cities, then the Sumerians may have passed down spoken memory of a much deeper past than their own genetic depth would suggest. The impossible reigns of the king list may have been the only language open to a Bronze Age scribe trying to describe a timeline that came before his own civilization by tens of thousands of years. That reading is a guess. The data behind the rankings is not. There is one more detail in the genetic record that researchers have been slow to discuss in public. The Khoisan rock art panels in the Drakensberg Mountains include drawings of figures that scholars have struggled to read. Some are clearly sand hunters, you can tell by the bow and quiver. Others are not. The work of David Lewis Williams, the South African archaeologist who spent decades writing up these sites from the 1980s onward, argued that some of the panels show shamans in trance states, meeting beings that the San worldview calls the spirit world. The Khoisan themselves, when asked about specific panels, sometimes describe the figures as the first people, the ones who were here before our ancestors. Whatever those panels show, the people who painted them have been steadily present on the same land for longer than any other civilization the planet has ever produced. For most of the last 100 years, the answer to which civilization came first was settled. Sumer, around 4000 BCE, Egypt a few centuries behind, the Indus Valley, the Norte Chico, then the rest. That answer is no longer the answer. The oldest civilization on Earth, by the only biological clock we have, never built a city, never carved a tablet, never raised a ziggurat. They walked the shore of a vast ancient wetland in what is now northern Botswana, and their descendants are still walking, still hunting, still telling stories that linguists believe began before any writing system on the planet existed. The cradle of civilization is not in southern Mesopotamia. It is somewhere in the dust of the Kalahari, in a genetic chain that runs 200,000 years deep, in a people whose civilization was never measured because nobody knew what to measure. The Sumerians were brilliant, the Egyptians were brilliant, the Indus Valley engineers were brilliant, but none of them came first, by a margin of nearly 200,000 years. The 2023 ranking has been peer-reviewed, repeated, and taken into the wider genetics field. It is no longer disputed. It is the new starting point. And what it means is still being worked out, in journals and at conferences and in the slow process by which textbooks get rewritten. The story we have told ourselves about human origins is incomplete in a way that the data now makes impossible to ignore. The Khoisan rock art in the Drakensberg Mountains holds scenes that no archaeologist has been able to date for sure, partly because the pictures do not match anything in the standard timeline. Some of those panels may be the oldest story records on Earth. Next week, I'm covering what those paintings actually show, and why one specific image at a site called Game Pass Shelter has had researchers arguing for 40 years. The video on screen breaks down another ancient genetic ranking that put a different civilization in a place nobody saw coming. Click it.